It was a quiet evening in the small town, the kind where the roads felt calm, and the sky was painted with the last colors of the setting sun. Officer David Hunter, a man in his late 30s, had spent the past few hours patrolling the main highway. He was used to the routine. A few speeders here and there, some late-night drivers rushing home, and the occasional person forgetting to use their blinker. But tonight felt different, like something was about to change. David adjusted his rearview mirror, glancing at the empty passenger seat beside him. The seat used to be filled with laughter, his son's laughter. But now, it was just empty space. It had been months since he had last seen Jake, his 9-year-old son, and David couldn't shake the feeling that he had let him down. He had promised Jake they'd spend more time together, but after the accident that took his wife, his life had been turned upside down. Work became his escape, and home became a place he tried to avoid. Just then, a car zoomed by, speeding past the speed limit. David's instincts kicked in. He quickly flipped on his lights, the blue and red flashing in the quiet night. The car didn't seem to slow down at first, but then it pulled over to the side of the road, a soft screech as the tires came to a halt. David took a deep breath, straightened his uniform, and stepped out of the patrol car. As he walked toward the car, he could see the driver's face in the rearview mirror. It was a woman, early 30s, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her expression one of nervousness. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. The car had hospital stickers on the bumper, something that caught David's attention. Maybe she was late for work, he thought. He reached the driver's side and knocked on the window. The woman rolled it down, a slight tremor in her voice as she spoke. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to speed. I'm running late for my shift at the hospital." "It's been a long day," she explained, her eyes wide with worry. David nodded, keeping his voice calm. "It's okay, ma'am. I understand. But speeding is still a violation of the law. May I see your driver's license and registration?" As she fumbled for her papers, David's eyes shifted to the passenger seat. There, sitting quietly, was a young boy. The boy didn't seem to be paying much attention to what was happening outside the car. He was staring out the window, his hands folded in his lap. At first, David didn't think much of it. But then he saw the boy's face more clearly. His heart skipped a beat. There was something strangely familiar about the child. The boy had dark hair, the same shade as David's own. His eyes were a deep brown, just like David's. For a moment, David felt a strange jolt, as if he had seen a ghost. He quickly turned his attention back to the woman in the driver's seat. "Ma'am, can I ask who the child is in the passenger seat?" David asked, his voice steady but his mind racing. The woman paused, and for a split second, it seemed like time stood still. David stood frozen for a moment, staring at the boy in the passenger seat. His heart raced as the boy's face looked more and more familiar with each passing second. The dark hair, the brown eyes, everything about him reminded David of someone he hadn't seen in months. He quickly blinked, trying to clear his thoughts. It was impossible, right? There was no way this boy could be. "Mom." David spoke again, his voice sounding a little more urgent. "Who is the child with you?" The woman seemed startled by his question. She took a deep breath, her eyes flickering nervously from the boy to David. "His name is Jake," she replied softly. He's my foster child." David felt his chest tighten. Jake? The name struck him like a lightning bolt. His mind flashed back to the days when he used to play with his own son, Jake. He had been so close to him, laughing, running around, building forts in the backyard. But that was before everything changed. That was before his wife passed away, and everything fell apart. After that, Jake was gone, vanished without a trace. David had searched everywhere, putting up posters, checking every lead. But now, standing in front of him, was a boy named Jake. The woman seemed to sense his confusion. "I know this must be a surprise," she said, her voice gentle. But I didn't know he was your son until recently." David's heart pounded as he tried to process her words. He took a small step back, still not fully believing what he was hearing. Could this really be Jake? Could this child, sitting quietly in the car, really be his own son? The woman continued, "I've been taking care of Jake for a few months now. His family situation was, well, it wasn't good. The foster care system called me, and I agreed to take him in temporarily." She paused, looking at the boy with a soft, caring smile. "He's a good kid. He's been through a lot, but he's strong. I didn't know he was connected to you until just recently. I found out from a neighbor who mentioned that you're a police officer." David blinked, his thoughts racing. It was true. He hadn't been able to find Jake, and now this woman, a stranger, had been caring for him all this time. He couldn't believe how close Jake had been to him, just out of reach. For a moment, David couldn't find the words. He stared at the boy, who was still looking out the window, unaware of the conversation happening around him. The quiet, the stillness in the car only made David feel more overwhelmed. The woman noticed his silence and spoke again. "I know this is a lot to take in. I wanted to talk to you sooner, but I wasn't sure how. I didn't want to push you, and I didn't know if you even wanted to see him again." David swallowed hard, his emotions rising. How could she know how I felt? He wanted to see Jake. He had been desperate to see him. But the pain of losing him and not knowing where he was had never gone away. And now, here he was, standing right in front of him, in the passenger seat of a stranger's car. David finally found his voice. I didn't know," he said quietly, his throat tight. "I didn't know he was here, with you." David's mind was spinning. The world around him seemed to blur, and he couldn't quite focus on what the woman, Sarah, was saying anymore. He kept glancing at the boy in the passenger seat. Jake, was this really happening? Was this the son he thought he'd lost forever? The car's engine hummed softly in the background as Sarah continued speaking. "I know this is overwhelming, Officer Hunter. I'm sorry for not contacting you sooner," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I wasn't sure how to bring it up. Jake's been through so much already. I didn't want to cause him more pain." David struggled to process the information. He hadn't seen Jake in months. Ever since his wife had died in the accident, things had been different. Jake had been taken away to stay with relatives, and David had lost track of him. The pain of losing his wife had made everything harder, and the thought of being the single father was overwhelming. So he buried himself in work, hoping the weight would lift, but it never did. But now here was Sarah, telling him that Jake had been in her care all this time. His son, the boy he'd been searching for, was right here, just a few feet away. He had been so close and yet so far. "Sarah, I don't understand," David said, his voice shaky. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? I've been looking for Jake everywhere. Why didn't you contact me?" Sarah sighed, her eyes looking down for a moment as she struggled to find the right words. "I didn't know how. I know you're a good person, but you've been through so much. I thought you might not want to see him. I didn't want to push you if you weren't ready. And I didn't know what to say. What if you didn't want him?" David was silent for a long moment. The weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. What if she was right? What if he wasn't ready? But the answer came to him quickly. Of course he was ready. He had always been ready. The truth was, he had never stopped loving Jake. He just didn't know how to find him. And now, he felt like he had missed out on so much time. Finally, David spoke again, his voice soft but filled with determination. "I don't care about the past. I want to see my son. I need to see him." His heart felt heavy, but also lighter at the same time, as if a burden had been lifted. He knew this was just the beginning, and he had so much to make up for. But he was ready. Sarah nodded, a look of relief crossing her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I knew you were a good man. Jake needs you more than anyone. He's been through a lot, and it's been hard for him. But I think you can help him heal." David turned his gaze back to the boy in the passenger seat. Jake had finally turned his head and was now looking at David, his eyes wide and filled with curiosity. There was a quiet, unspoken connection between them, even though neither of them knew where to start. David took a deep breath. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. He was going to do whatever it took to get his son back. David stood there, staring at the boy in the passenger seat. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his thoughts felt jumbled. He wanted to run over to Jake, scoop him up, and tell him everything would be okay. But he didn't know where to start. His emotions were so tangled: relief, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. He had lost so much time with his son. Jake was staring back at him, his eyes wide and unsure. The boy's face looked so much like David's own, yet there was a distance between them. It was clear that Jake didn't recognize him as his father, not yet, anyway. David's mind kept racing back to the day his wife had passed away. The pain of losing her was still fresh in his memory, even after all this time. And then, losing Jake, it was almost too much to bear. In the months that followed, he had done everything he could to find his son. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, standing in front of the boy he had been searching for, only to realize they were strangers to each other now. Sarah noticed the hesitation in David's eyes. She gently reached over to touch his arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "I know this is a lot, but Jake needs you. He's been through a lot, and I'm sure he's just as confused as you are." David nodded but didn't say anything. He had so many questions. How had Jake been since the accident? Had he been happy? Had he been well taken care of? There was so much David had missed, so much he wished he could undo. Finally, David found his voice. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his words coming out quieter than he expected. "I've missed him so much. I never thought I'd get the chance to make it right." Sarah gave him a gentle smile. "It's never too late," she said. "Jake needs a father, and you've got so much love to give. He just needs to know that you're here for him." David turned back to Jake, who was still sitting quietly in the passenger seat. The boy looked uncertain, but also curious. David's heart softened. He knelt down beside the car, trying to be on the boy's level. He wanted to reach out, but he didn't know if Jake was ready. "Jake," David said softly, his voice shaking a little. "It's me, your dad. I know you might not remember me, but I've been looking for you. I've missed you so much. And I'm so sorry for everything that's happened." Jake's eyes were filled with confusion. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't speak. David took another deep breath and smiled gently. "I know this is all a lot to take in," he continued, "but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to make sure you're safe, and I'm going to be the dad you need me to be." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. David watched Jake carefully, hoping for some sign that the boy was ready to take the first step toward healing. Finally, Jake shifted in his seat again, his eyes softening just a little. Sarah smiled softly. "It'll take time, David, but he'll come around. He just needs you to show him that you're here for him." David nodded, feeling a sense of determination rise within him. This was just the beginning. He wasn't going to lose his son again. David couldn't tear his eyes away from Jake. The boy had barely spoken, just quietly watching him. There was a knot in David's chest, a mix of hope and uncertainty. The last thing he wanted was to overwhelm Jake, but his heart was aching with the need to say more, to explain everything. He needed to be close to his son again. But before David could say anything else, Sarah spoke up. Her voice was calm, like she had been through moments like this before. "It's going to take time," she said gently. "I've been caring for Jake for a few months now, and I've gotten to know him. I think you're going to be a great father to him, David, but it won't happen overnight. He's been through a lot, and so have you." David nodded, his mind racing. He couldn't believe how much time he had missed. He had been so focused on his own grief, on the loss of his wife, that he had lost track of everything else. And now, standing in front of him, was Jake, the son he hadn't seen in months. Sarah gave him a soft smile. "I'll tell you what I can. It might help you understand Jake a little more." David sat back on his heels and nodded, his gaze shifting back to Sarah. He was listening, hoping she could offer some insight into the boy who had once been his whole world. "I met Jake when the foster care system called me," Sarah began, her voice steady. "He had been through some difficult times with his family before I took him in. His life had been unstable for a while, and he was pretty guarded when I first met him. But over time, he warmed up. He's smart, kind-hearted, and surprisingly strong for his age." David felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe Jake hadn't forgotten him completely. "He's a great kid," Sarah continued. "But like I said, things haven't been easy for him. His family background, it's not something he talks about much. He's been through a lot of changes, and it's hard for him to trust. But I think that's where you come in, David." David listened carefully, his heart heavy. He wondered how many times Jake had wanted to be with him, and how much he had suffered in silence. What had he been through? What had he seen? Sarah's eyes softened as she spoke again. "Jake hasn't really opened up about his past. He doesn't talk about it much, but he's never asked about you directly. It's like he doesn't want to hope anymore, in case he's let down. I think he's afraid of getting his hopes up and then losing you again." David's chest tightened. It broke his heart to think that Jake might have given up hope of ever seeing him again. He should have been there. He should have done more. But he couldn't change the past. All he could do now was move forward, step by step, and show Jake that he wasn't going to leave again. "I'll do whatever it takes," David said quietly. "I want to be the father he deserves. I want to make it right." Sarah gave him a small, reassuring nod. "I believe you, David. But just remember, it's going to take time. He needs to trust you again, and that won't happen in one day." David stood up, looking at Jake once more. "I know," he said softly, "but I'm not going anywhere." David couldn't stop thinking about everything Sarah had told him. He sat in his car, staring out the window, trying to clear his mind. He had so many questions, and yet the answers were still unclear. Jake had been through so much, and he was afraid that he had missed his chance to make things right. What if it was too late? What if the bond between them was broken forever? But as he thought about it more, something inside him clicked. He wasn't going to give up on his son. He couldn't. It didn't matter how long it took or how hard it would be. David was going to do whatever it took to be the father Jake needed him to be. He glanced over at Sarah, who was waiting patiently by the car, giving him the space he needed to think. She had been kind and understanding, but David could see the concern in her eyes. She wanted to help, but she also knew that it was up to him now. Jake was his responsibility, and it was time for him to step up. Taking a deep breath, David walked over to where Sarah stood. He could see that she was watching him closely, waiting for him to make a decision. "Sarah," David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I need to ask you something." Sarah nodded, her expression soft. "Of course, David. What is it?" David hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. "I want to take Jake with me. I want him to come home with me." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she seemed to be processing what David had said. She had been the one to take care of Jake for months, and she knew how difficult it could be to let go. But at the same time, she understood that this was the right thing for Jake. He needed to reconnect with his father, and David needed to prove to Jake that he was there for him, no matter what. After a long pause, Sarah nodded slowly. "I think that's a good idea, David. But you have to understand, Jake isn't going to just come around overnight. He's been through a lot, and he's scared. He doesn't know if he can trust you yet." David felt a lump form in his throat. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there was a lot of work ahead of him. But he wasn't about to let fear hold him back. Jake was his son, and he was going to make things right. "I understand," David said softly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to give up on him." Sarah gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I believe you, David. Just take it slow. Let Jake come to you when he's ready." David nodded, his determination growing. He turned to Jake, who was still sitting quietly in the passenger seat of the car. The boy hadn't moved, but David could see that his eyes were watching him carefully. David took a step toward the car, his heart pounding as he slowly opened the door. "Jake," David said gently, his voice filled with warmth. "I know this is a lot, but I'm your dad. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Jake's eyes flickered with something. Uncertainty, maybe hope. But he didn't say anything. David reached out a hand, waiting for the boy to take it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. David's heart raced as he looked down at his outstretched hand, waiting for Jake to take it. He had said the words, but he wasn't sure if Jake was ready to trust him again. There had been so much time lost, so many moments that David would never get back. But he was determined. This was his chance to make things right, no matter how long it would take. Jake looked at David's hand for a long moment, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He didn't move, and David felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He wanted to reach out and pull Jake into his arms, but he knew better than to push too hard. This wasn't something that could be rushed. "Jake," David said softly, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "You don't have to decide everything right now. But I want you to know that I'm here for you. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be the father you need, and I'm going to be here for you every step of the way." There was a long pause as Jake continued to stare at David's hand. Then, slowly, with a hesitant movement, Jake reached out and placed his hand in David's. David's heart soared, and a tear slipped down his cheek, though he quickly wiped it away. It was a small step, but it meant the world to him. Jake wasn't pulling away. He was willing to take a chance, to trust David just a little. That was all David needed. Sarah, who had been watching quietly from a distance, smiled softly. She had seen how much David cared for Jake, and she knew this was the right step. She had seen so many children struggle to form relationships with their parents after being in foster care. But David wasn't giving up. He was willing to do whatever it took to show Jake that he was loved and wanted. David gently helped Jake out of the car, guiding him carefully as the boy stepped onto the ground. The moment felt unreal, as if David was still waiting for something to snap him out of the dream. But Jake was real. This was his son. He was here, standing beside him. "Are you okay?" David asked softly, crouching down to Jake's level. "I know this is a lot, and you might be feeling confused or scared. It's okay to feel that way. But I want you to know that you're not alone anymore." Jake didn't respond right away, but his eyes were filled with so many emotions: fear, curiosity, hope, and even a little sadness. David didn't expect him to have all the answers, and he didn't need Jake to say anything. He just needed him to know that he was there, that David was never going to leave again. Sarah walked over and placed a hand gently on David's shoulder. "You're doing great, David," she said quietly. "You've made a lot of progress already." David smiled at her, grateful for her support. "Thank you, Sarah. I just hope Jake knows how much I love him." "I'm sure he does," Sarah replied. "It'll take time, but he'll come to understand. You're already starting to build something real here." David nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Jake. Together, they would figure this out. Together, they would build a future. The next few days were a blur of emotions for David. He had never imagined that reconnecting with Jake would be so complicated, but he was more determined than ever. Every moment with his son felt both like a small victory and a reminder of everything they had missed. Jake was quiet, often staying to himself, but there were small signs of progress. When David would sit next to him on the couch, Jake wouldn't pull away. He didn't smile much, but sometimes David caught him glancing at him from the corner of his eye, his expression uncertain but not hostile. It was clear that Jake was still processing everything, still unsure of what to make of this new life, but David could see the flicker of trust beginning to form. One afternoon, David decided to take Jake out for a walk. He wanted to do something simple, something to help them bond without pressure. They walked side by side, with David talking about the little things in life. The weather, the birds they saw in the trees, the flowers in the garden. At first, Jake didn't say much, but David wasn't discouraged. He knew that every word, every shared moment, was important. As they walked around the block, Jake stopped and pointed to a small bench in the park. "Can we sit there?" he asked quietly. David's heart swelled. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Of course," he said with a smile. They sat together, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that spoke of trust slowly being rebuilt. Jake was the first to break the silence. "I used to go to the park with my mom," he said softly, looking down at his shoes. "She would push me on the swings. I liked that." David's heart ached. He knew Jake's mother was gone, and he could only imagine how much it hurt for his son to think about those times. But instead of avoiding the conversation, David gently responded, "I bet she loved you very much, and I'm sure she would be proud of how strong you are." Jake looked up at him, his eyes filled with both sadness and curiosity. "You really think that?" David nodded, his voice full of sincerity. "I know that. You're a strong boy, Jake. I can see that in you, and I'm proud of you too." Jake didn't say anything for a moment, but he looked at David with a softer expression. It wasn't a smile, but it was progress. Slowly, but surely, they were getting closer. As they sat there, David reflected on how far they had come in just a few days. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be times when Jake pulled away again, but David was ready for it. He was patient now, not rushing anything, just letting it happen in its own time. They stood up and continued walking. This time, Jake walked a little closer to David, not quite holding his hand, but walking side by side. It was a small step, but it was a sign that Jake was beginning to trust him again. David smiled to himself. They weren't there yet, but they were on their way. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like he had hope again. A new beginning was taking shape, and this time, they would face it together. It had been a few weeks since David had brought Jake home, and things were starting to feel more normal. The house, once quiet and lonely, now had a sense of warmth. There were still moments of silence between them, moments when the weight of the past seemed to linger, but those moments were becoming less and less. Jake was beginning to open up, just a little at a time. One evening after dinner, David and Jake were sitting together on the couch. David was watching a baseball game on TV, but Jake seemed distracted. He was fiddling with a toy car in his hands, his eyes focused on the screen but not really watching. David could sense the tension in the air, like Jake was on the edge of saying something but didn't know how. David decided to break the silence. "How's school going?" he asked gently, hoping to steer the conversation towards something that might make Jake feel more at ease. Jake shrugged, his eyes still on the toy car. "It's okay," he said, his voice quiet. "I don't have many friends." David nodded, trying not to sound too overbearing. "That can be tough sometimes," he said, his tone kind and understanding. "But you've got me, and you've got this house. We're a team, Jake, always." Jake looked up then, meeting David's eyes for the first time in a while. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, uncertainty, but also a small hint of hope. He paused for a moment before speaking again. I like it here," he said, almost as if testing the words out. David's heart warmed at the sound of those words. "I'm glad," he said with a smile. "I like it here too. It feels like we're finally starting to make this work." Jake gave a small smile, the first real one David had seen in a long time. It was a shy, uncertain smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. And that was enough. For the first time in what felt like forever, David didn't feel like an outsider in his own life. He was starting to feel like a father again. The next day, David decided to take Jake to the park. He didn't say much about it at first, just told Jake to get ready. The idea was simple, to spend some time outside, away from the house, just the two of them. It had been a while since they'd done something like that, and David wanted to create more positive memories. When they arrived at the park, Jake was hesitant at first. He stood by the swings, looking unsure, but David didn't push him. Instead, he walked over to the nearby bench and sat down, casually watching the other kids play. After a few minutes, Jake slowly walked over and sat next to him. "I can't remember the last time I played on the swings," Jake said quietly, looking at the playground. David smiled. "Well, it's never too late. We can always give it a try." Jake nodded, and with a small smile, he stood up and walked over to the swings. David watched him, his heart full. It wasn't much, but it was a step. Jake was starting to feel more at ease with the world again, starting to trust that things were changing. As the day went on, they spent hours at the park, laughing and talking. It was a simple day, but it meant the world to both of them. David didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he had hope. Jake was starting to come back to him, and that was all he needed. When they finally left the park and headed home, Jake was quieter than usual, but there was something different about him. He had a smile on his face, a small, quiet smile, but it was the most genuine one he had ever seen. As they drove back to the house, David couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. Together, they were starting a new chapter, a chapter full of hope, love, and second chances.